Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today are two of our longtime friends of the podcast. First, we want to welcome Tobias Ackermann from the Blomstein law firm. Tobias, welcome.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
And Caroline Watson, longtime guest of the podcast, and back again to talk about our topic of the day, sanctions and Russia. So, welcome back, Caroline.
Hi, Tim.
All right. Well, today what we'd like to talk about is we wanted to talk about with Tobias one of the recent EU sanctions package, the 16th package that was released in early March. I know that we had some members of Blomstein on before. We'd had Florian and Hannah to talk about the 14th package, but now we're up to 16. That was about a month ago. And so, Tobias, why don't we talk about that, and then we can, Caroline and I will compare and contrast with where sanctions are going in Russia, because the EU seems kind of on the same track that it's been on since 2022, but the Russia sanctions are in the US might be a little bit different. So why don't you kick it off with some discussion about package 16?
Yeah, that's right, Tim. So the EU continues to be on this program of regularly enhancing their sanctions regime. Actually, yesterday it was reported in the news that the EU will be preparing an additional 17th package to be discussed in May. But you're right, the last one from March was the 16th package, and it introduced certain new mechanisms, but most of all it expanded existing ones. So we've seen additional sanctions on ships that were used by Russia as part of their shadow fleet to evade sanctions, so in particular the oil price gap, for example. And we've seen an increase in an expansion in the list of goods that are subject to import bans. Here it's primary aluminum, for example, that has raised some attention. As regards to the exports, it's additional industry and high-tech goods. We've also seen more services that are now covered by the sanctions, namely construction services. We've seen additional software falling now under the sanctions. And we've seen a kind of a trend that started already last year, that the EU has kind of increased the reach of its sanctions, moving toward extraterritoriality. And maybe moving back a step, the EU always has been very skeptical, to say the least, of the approach of especially the United States when it comes to requiring third country operators to follow their economic sanctions. But now we've seen that a lot of third country companies have become subject to restrictions. Previously, it was always linked to suppliers that used European companies to facilitate trade in very sensitive goods used on the battlefield by Russia. And that has been expanded insofar as they are now, these entities are now subject to a general export ban with respect to certain dual-use items. And these are, mostly traders in China and Turkey, but we've also seen certain service providers in other countries. So it's really the grasp has been increased by the pressure has been increased by the Europeans also on third country operators. That also applies to banks. So there are now, for the first time, non-Russian banks subject to the SWIFT ban. And perhaps that is also something in response to the US approach, or the lack thereof, because it seems that the EU is now following the example of the US to force or require non-EU operators to follow EU sanctions. So yeah, I think that's the most important. These are the most important aspects of these latest sanctions.
That's really helpful, Tobias. I'm always, as the Russia sanctions program from the EU has gone on, I've always been, in some ways, amused by the fact that the EU has come to the realization that it's very hard to enforce your sanctions rules if you essentially have a lot of non-EU companies that take EU goods and then send them to the sanctioned country. And so that is a dilemma, because I know that in many ways it's offensive to have these extraterritorial rules where one country seems to be legislating what somebody can do in their own country, but it is, as a practical matter, very difficult to have a sanctions regime without it. So, Caroline, why don't you set the stage for us as to where the U.S. is going now that we have a new president, and the new president is taking us in a new direction overall, but with respect to sanctions as well. So why don't you talk a little bit about where the U.S. has gone in the last few months with respect to its Russia sanctions?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim and Tobias. So just to back up a little bit, before Trump actually took office, it's important to note, I think, that there was a flurry of activity at the end of the Biden administration, I think in anticipation for some changes that they expected would come. In the last month alone, there were designations upwards of 450 persons and entities in two different enforcement actions. And I think notable is that a lot of these designations took place under a different executive order than has been the primary executive order under these Russia sanctions. Biden took it back to an executive order that has significant implications in terms of the lifting of sanctions. So when he redesignated or designated a lot of these entities, he essentially was able to trigger some restrictions that I think we'll talk about in a minute under the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions. CATSA. Sorry, I can't always get all the words for that acronym. So basically, using this tool, he was trying to limit the future ability to lift sanctions unilaterally by the executive branch. And so I think we'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about what may be coming in terms of lifting the Russia sanctions. But he took all these measures right before he left office, and then Trump came in, and I think it is interesting. We didn't have in the U.S. another tranche of sanctions to mirror the EU's sanctions in March. Most of the sanctions actions since Trump took office have been focused towards Iran and a few other sanctions programs, but not much with respect to Russia at this point. And so he hasn't been enforcing significantly, but we also haven't yet seen a significant easing or lifting of sanctions, although that is in the air. He's taken a very different approach with respect to Russia diplomatically, engaging in discussions fairly quickly after he took office. Most recently, in March, his administration has been trying to arrange this Black Sea ceasefire agreement, and that could have implications in terms of easing sanctions with regard to Russia. Now, that's very iffy at this point, whether that deal will actually materialize, for a couple of reasons. One being just the nature of negotiations and getting the parties to fulfill their commitments. But also, the big ask that Russia presented as a part of these talks to the United States was to start easing sanctions on agricultural trade exports and related financial institutions, and in particular the Russell-Close Bank. And apparently the U.S. agreed that this was something that they would start implementing if the ceasefire takes place. However, it is noteworthy that the EU would essentially need to be involved to make that kind of lifting of sanctions effective, particularly when it comes to financial institutions. because with the SWIFT ban, and SWIFT being an EU organization, that if the U.S. were to decide to just unilaterally lift sanctions on financial institutions, that wouldn't actually have as much effect as it needs to have for them to be rehabilitated, essentially.
Well, so you've laid out a lot of things that have happened. So I want to walk through a few of the consequences of some of them. So first off, it sounds to me from the way you were describing it, and particularly his actions with respect to CATSA, that former President Biden was essentially trying to lock down the U.S. sanctions before President Trump took office in a way that made it harder to undo them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So there's an executive order, 13662, that incorporates or was incorporated into CATSA itself, such that when an entity is designated under that executive order, there are restrictions under CATSA that come into play that basically provide that sanctions cannot be lifted or eased without some form of notification or approval by Congress to do so. And so by designating these parties under CATSA, President Biden made it very difficult to just delist some of these parties or even grant significant general licenses that would have the effect of changing U.S. foreign policy. And so requiring that Congress be involved in any of those kinds of measures.
And prior to that, so basically for the first more than 2 years of the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions against Russia, President Biden hadn't used CATSA, is the way I understand it. He'd used Executive Order 14024 for all of the sanctions, which had no statutory basis other than IEPA, the Emergency Powers Act, but had basically all executive order, nothing that was codified like CATSA. And then he, at the very end of his term, basically imposed a lot of the same sanctions under CATSA. Any explanation as to why he did that other than trying to lock President Trump down?
That's my understanding. If you have some insight on that, that would be great. But I think that that honestly, he was trying to, make these sanctions a little more difficult to lift before he left.
And then, as I understand what the discussion about President Trump, it sounds like sanctions relief may be on the table, particularly when it comes to the Black Sea as part of these negotiations. But at least so far, there hasn't been even kind of an initial deal. Is that basically fair to say?
Right. I think the terms of the deal are still not finalized or implemented by the parties. And so their sanctions relief won't be coming until that actually happens. But also we have to have some kind of agreement with the EU to provide the relief that Russia is seeking.
Well, and that last point is what I wanted to turn to Tobias for. And I know that I'm putting you on the spot, Tobias. But basically, the negotiations, as I understand them, that President Trump has established are really U.S.-led negotiations at which both the Russian government and the Ukraine government have been involved in at times. My understanding is they're taking place in Saudi Arabia. If the EU is asked to provide some form of sanctions relief in support of these negotiations, I mean, where is your sense that the EU would be on these issues, or has the EU said anything about where it would be on these issues?
Yeah, I think the EU has repeatedly emphasized that they will not be part of a deal that kind of reverses the role of a victim and the aggressor, right? So they've said that they do not want to accept any deal that does not involve or neglects the interests of Ukraine. And I think as long as they are not at the table themselves, it's going to be really hard for the US to convince them to agree to any kind of deal. having in mind also that all EU member states have to agree. So they would have to agree on the lifting of any kind of sanction.
So that's important to lift even the sanctions with respect to agricultural traffic on the Black Sea. That would require all 27 member states to support the lifting?
That's exactly right, yeah. And that's what happened a few months ago with respect to Syria. But so we need to have a regulation that is adopted by the Council of the European Union, and this requires the confirmation of all member states, or all foreign ministers. And we've seen that certain countries, especially the Baltics, they are afraid of Russia, so to speak. We've also seen warnings by NATO that Russia apparently has some plans to test NATO. So I think there would have to be a great or a deal that would counter these fears and accommodate these interests, not only those of Ukraine, but also those of the Eastern European members.
Okay. So that it sounds like this deal is going to be relatively complicated if it comes together. I mean, so far it seems like there's not been agreement between Ukraine and Russia even to a temporary ceasefire. So seem a long way from a deal.
Yeah,
but when it comes, go ahead.
We should also not forget to mention the recent atrocities, right? So we've seen that Russia really ignores all rules of the law of armed conflict. They target civilian, and I think this is, for the EU at least, it's a deal breaker, right? So there would have to be significant changes in the way Russia conducts itself if the EU would agree to any kind of deal.
And I believe the atrocities you're referring to are ones that I think members of President Trump's staff, including Ambassador Grinnell, have referred to as the atrocities in terms of the bombing that took place. Was in advance of the Easter holiday, while people were celebrating in eastern Ukraine and children were killed. My understanding is there were large loss of life within the past few days. I mean, we're recording this on April 15th. I think the bombing took place on the 13th. It might have been the 14th. And so yeah, I think that is probably not leading in the direction of a peaceful resolution of this conflict anytime soon. In terms of the attitude of the EU, we've not only seen divergence on issues related to sanctions, but I'm not sure you heard, but April 2nd was Liberation Day here in the United States.
Right.
And on Liberation Day, President Trump announced a whole series of tariffs, including ones that targeted the EU with a 20% tariff. They're called reciprocal tariffs, but they're not, I guess from the name you might think that the U.S. was going to impose tariffs that were equal to the tariffs that were being imposed by the country that was being reciprocated against. But they're not based on tariffs because the EU doesn't have 20% tariffs. But my understanding is they're being imposed based on the size of the U.S. trade deficit with the country or the region that's been targeted. So how can you just talk a little bit about how those tariffs are being perceived in the EU and kind of whether that makes the EU more or less likely to cooperate in a deal resolving the Ukraine conflict where the EU would be asked to lift some sanctions in exchange?
Yeah, I would say it does not increase the trust the EU has in the US administration right now. The tariffs are generally perceived as unfair and illegal. So you said that, I mean, there was a bit of confusion at the beginning of where the numbers come from. But it's also my understanding that it's the trade deficit, totally neglecting that when it comes to the trade in services, we have a deficit the other way around. So the US, as the largest exporter of services, that has been carefully neglected to take into account. And we've seen already some responses by the EU also in terms of measures. Maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But generally speaking, I wouldn't say that it enhances the chances of any kind of deal in the near future that would resolve for the Ukraine issue.
Right. It does seem like, the U.S. and the EU are, based on the tariffs, growing a little even further apart than they are on sanctions. Now, I should note that President Trump has paused the additional tariffs. Now, there is a baseline of 10%, and that is applying to the EU and to everywhere that's not the U.S. After April 5th, it's been applied, and it's sticking in place going forward. But the additional tariff that was going to be a total of 20% on the EU is not applied. I also, should mention that there's a 25% tariff that President Trump has placed on imported automobiles that would apply to EU countries as well. And so, why don't you talk a little bit about, apart from kind of the general vibe in the EU that might spill over into sanctions, some of the specific actions that the EU is thinking about taking with respect to, in response to both the automobile tariff, the reciprocal 10% tariff, and the potential 20% reciprocal tariff.
So I think to understand that we have to move back 7 years. In 2018 and 2020, the EU already reacted to first tariffs during the first Trump administration, and they put counter tariffs on I think jeans and steel and motorcycles, and these measures were, when Biden came into office, were suspended after a negotiation with them. And this suspension was to expire. So the Commission, the European Commission, said that they would let this suspension expire, and then the counter tariffs would again come into force. So this would be the first line of response. The second line would be additional tariffs on a very large number of goods. So there is the list of goods affected, or the CN codes of goods affected, is quite large. It encompasses industrial goods, but also agriculture products. So this would be an additional new imposition of counter tariffs. And these were, or the instrument for that was actually adopted yesterday on the 14th of April. And on the same day, they suspended it, or they suspended the other measures again, because they also wanted to mirror this delay or the 90 days grace period that was implemented by Trump. And the EU said that they wanted to have these additional months until July, I guess, to negotiate with Trump to find a solution.
So a tariff for a tariff and a pause for a pause, I guess.
Exactly.
And why don't you talk a little bit? I'm curious as to some of the counter tariffs. I know that Canada, for example, and some other places have come up with counter tariffs that they think kind of go to the base of voters who are President Trump's biggest supporters. So,
yeah.
You mentioned agricultural tariffs, and I assume those are, some of these tariffs are designed to go after the base. One of President Trump's bases with U.S. farmers in the middle part of our country, and a lot of countries are targeting those tariffs. I think China, or those folks for tariffs. I think China is as well. Are there any other types of kind of targeted EU tariffs that are designed to go after President Trump's base?
Yes, I think it's a similar approach in the EU. So it's also targeting the so-called red states and the products there. And as you said, it's designed to, hurt the people that tend to support the U.S. government. There was a discussion about taxing, in addition to the tariffs, also the IT services that would rather target the big IT companies, Apple, Amazon, Meta, you name it. But I guess that's only an idea so far, because it also is a bit of a regulatory issue here. But that was also in discussion. So far, we've seen only counter tariffs, and as you said, targeting the base of the Trump administration's supporters.
Now, we've heard a little bit also on the tariff area about an anti-coercion instrument that the EU adopted in 2023.
The bazooka.
The bazooka. Let's hear a little bit about the bazooka.
Yeah, I think that's a good, or the image campaign of the EU's instrument here works very well, because everyone calls it the bazooka, at least in the EU. It's a so-called anti-coercion instrument, and was designed not so much with a view to US pressure, but more with a view to China. And it's to counter coercion. So it's not exactly clear what is meant by that. We have a similar expression in public international law, where it says, if you use economic pressure to change a behavior and thus violate the independence and sovereignty of another country, that would be a violation of international rules. So I guess the idea of this anti-coercion instrument is the same. If a third country pressures the EU or some of its member states into something they don't want to do, and they use not physical force, not military force, but something that is akin to it when it comes to economic measures, then this anti-coercion instrument is triggered. Now, it's not clear whether the tariffs alone would constitute such a coercion, or whether it's more, as Trump would maybe put it, tough negotiation, right? So it's not quite clear whether the EU will really use that instrument. But if they did, and that's why it's called the bazooka, the legal consequences would be quite severe, because it offers the European Union quite a large number of instruments that they could take, or measures they could take. So tariffs is just one option. The other ones are trade restrictions, for example, import quotas. You could see US companies being excluded from public procurement procedures. You could see a waiver of intellectual property rights protection. So it's quite a wide margin here, and the EU has never used it because it's so new, the instrument. But it would give them quite a substantial amount and quite an intensity or an intense level of reaction. We'll see whether that really plays out. But
well, and so I'm curious. So if the retaliatory tariffs don't work, even though they're not calculated in retaliation for tariffs, but are calculated in terms of the trade deficit, which is not kind of a common way that countries calculate tariffs, but if that's viewed as kind of hard negotiation, what would be the type of coercive measure that could spring the bazooka into action?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what kind of behavior are they trying to force the EU to. So the example of one coercion or one incident was China establishing export restriction because an EU member state recognized Taiwan as independent, and they wanted to change this foreign policy of the EU member states. So if it's not connected, let's say that it's not connected to the tariffs, to the measures, then you would more likely speak of coercion. But if the Trump administration's aim is to reduce market restrictions, right? So market access restrictions, then you could make the case that this is not a coercive measure because it's kind of a quid pro quo, where you see a connection between the tariffs and the measure that's thought after that also does not go to the essentials of what is government basically.
Got it. So essentially, it's got to be a rational way to get to protect a legitimate U.S. government interest. Basically, helping to open access to markets that the U.S. has decided.
Yeah, you could say so. I mean, another issue is that these tariffs are probably in violation of WTO law. So apart from this anti-coercion instrument, you could see that the EU would also react in kind and also say that, okay, if you breach WTO law, we can do the same and are justified as a kind of countermeasure under international law. So there certainly are other options apart from unpacking the bazooka.
All right. Well, then it probably will be held in reserve for now. But you did mention export controls and kind of restrictive export control measures. My understanding is that that BIS, so the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, that is the agency that enforces and creates many of our export control regulations here in the U.S., that the BIS has pulled out of the U.S. EU Trade and Technology Council. Is this something that is getting any notice in the EU? I mean, is this a body that has done great work in the past and this a big loss, or is this kind of a nothing?
Well, I think it enhances kind of a trend in export controls that started with Russia, again, coming back to the first topic, because most of the export controls on dual use are based on this Wassenaar agreement, and Russia is a part of that, and since they block everything now, there are no updates. So we've seen a lot of unilateral action by the United States, but also by EU member states. They have listed, for example, semiconductor and quantum computing technology that was not previously listed because it's so new. And I guess this lack of coordination will lead to a more fragmented system of export controls. Previously, you could say that the US and the EU have more or less the same rules, the US going a bit further, perhaps, in some respects, but I'm not sure whether that will hold true for the future.
Well, you mentioned an area where the EU and the US were cooperating on technology, and one of those was Russia, obviously. Because Russia's part of Wassenaar, it became impossible to really make Wassenaar changes because Wassenaar operates by consensus. So the EU and the US were cooperating because of that issue. But also, I know that the US has been kind of leading the charge for a decade now, so through various presidential administrations, to try and essentially persuade the EU that China and certainly China data issues were a big threat. How do we see, and I'll throw this to Caroline first, I mean, the U.S., where's the U.S. going on export controls related to China? And then Tobias, if you want to talk about whether the EU, if and whether the EU is likely to follow, I think that would be kind of a good final topic to talk about, because I think obviously when we talk about trade and EU-US cooperation, Russia is one issue, but I think China is probably, in the long run, the bigger issue.
Yeah, I do think that's an area where we'll see this change away from the traditional dialogue between the US and the EU have some impact, is with regard to China. Over the past several years, the export controls with respect to China have been ramping up, most recently with the AI diffusion rules. And the way that these export controls have been targeting China more and more is not just to control the export of the goods to China themselves, but then to also implement more extraterritorial kinds of controls, such as the foreign direct product rules that are more specific to China, that basically capture goods that are created outside of the United States under U.S. export controls using certain kinds of triggers, where there's a kind of tie back to the U.S. technology or software. But then more recently with the AI diffusion rules, there's some export controls that are very restrictive towards things that have not traditionally been controlled, such as infrastructure as a service and operations like this that utilize U.S. technology, particularly U.S. chips. And so this is an area where I think we were expecting to see a lot more collaboration with the EU because the controls, as they're written currently, do have some significant implications for those operating in the EU. But I guess it's to be determined how this plays out if the dialogue breaks down, whether there's going to be the kind of license exceptions or just ease of these export controls with respect to Europe that are tied to China to try to prevent the flow of technology and goods that are concerning, particularly semiconductors and quantum computing and AI-related technologies.
So, Tobias, you mentioned the cooperation on chips. Where do you see that going in light of the breakdown of the Technology Council and just other trends in terms of the relationship between the EU and the US?
Yeah, we've seen individual EU member states to implement national dual-use controls on chips, especially with a view to China. We have not seen that from the EU as a whole. So there may be approaches to that or ideas to implement a stricter policy towards China. As you know, there's also the idea of de-risking, so cutting a bit of the ties to China, and that also involves restricting perhaps the flow of know-how and particularly modern technology. So I definitely see that this is a concern, but that the EU has been a bit slow in finding a uniform approach to that. We've seen that the Commission, the European Commission, who is tasked with coordinating the trade policy, we've seen that they want to focus more on the at least EU-wide approaches, so align all the national lists, right? But so far that has not been done. But I think it's definitely a topic that they are very much aware of and that they are reviewing carefully, as is in respect to other technologies where we have already export controls in place. Exports to China have been reviewed by national authorities rather critically in many instances.
And have the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, altered the dynamic at all? Because I know both China and at least originally the EU were targeted. Now, China did not get a pause. The EU did, but at least at first, when the reciprocal tariffs came out, I heard some discussion about the EU and China talking about what they could do to deal with the tariffs, as a joint measure. So has that changed the dynamic at all?
I think not yet. I think there have been some political observers also who have said that they expect the EU to go to move from the US closer to China. I don't know whether that will really happen because of this rather skeptic approach to China in the last years. But that is definitely an option, that the EU, seeing that the US is perceived maybe not as a partner that is as reliable as in the past, they will seek other allies, right? So I don't know whether China really is the go-to guy there, but I mean, it's going to be interesting how the relations will play out.
Great. Well, I think that's the last word, Tobias. Caroline, Tobias, thanks for joining us today. And for everyone out there, stay sanctions free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.